Hello, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is the CATF of Fusion event on fusion energy, sustaining the net zero transition and energy security. Welcome. Couple of short practical indications. The first thing is please be using all the seats. Don't worry to go through for the newcomers. And second is there is a QR code that allows simultaneous translation, also in English. So if you feel that you want to use it, use it. Thank you. So we are going to have today a conversation about fusion and how fusion is going to help to sustain the net zero transition, and which main aspect needs to be pushed in order to make fusion a global industry. I'm Sehila Gonzalez, Global Director of the Fusion Program at Clean Air Task Force. I'm a physicist by training with a PhD on fusion materials and an MBA, with more than 20 years of experience in the field. Previously, I was working at the International Atomic Energy Agency as a senior expert on fusion, and I also chair of a number of international committees and also founder and chair of Women in Fusion. So, before we go into discussion with our distinguished expert, I would like to deliver a short introduction on what fusion is and what it is not, which is also important. Fusion is an existing source of energy. It's the power used by the stars, like the sun. We are already exposed to and benefiting from its energy. Fusion is based on the fuse of two light nuclei and the natural release of energy associated with that. So to make fusion work, the only condition is to design a device where this reaction can occur and be maintained, as simple as that. For that to occur, technological challenges need to be fulfilled. Reach sufficient high temperature, hundreds of millions of degrees, confine the nucleus close to enough with the help of magnetic fields, and maintain these conditions for enough time. Therefore, in fusion, there is not the possibility of chain reaction. On the contrary, the challenge is to keep the reaction happening. Fusion is a cleaner energy because we don't use fissile material or any transuranic element is produced. Only low-level waste is expected to be generated. All these factors relating to the inherently safe performance as well as the clean aspect of the process, together with the large energy density production, makes fusion a very attractive new source of energy. Industrial and regulatory bodies should capture this specific characteristic to get an appropriate framework allowing for a timely global development. And this is a key element in this discussion. We want to have fusion developed globally. And in particular, CATF, Clean Air Task Force, is working along that lines to help to set up international frameworks and standards that can apply globally to have a global market with a global industry. A key word of this discussion is to be speed. We need to move fast in the community. And we will explore how we can speed up speed for fusion. So with no more preamble, I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists. So starting from here, Jennifer Ganten is the Chief Global Affairs Officer at Commonwealth Fusion System. She is an accomplished policy, government, and public affairs executive with a proven track record of partnership with C-suite to address critical business issues. So, thank you for being here, Jennifer. Zabrina, who is there, is the Senior Director of Strategic Development at General Atomic, with over 20 years of experience in leading and maintaining high-impact projects and leading-edge technologies. So thank you for being here, Zabrina. Ralf Kaiser is the Head of Programs at the Abdul Salam International Center, so at the end of the line. For theoretical physics, he's an experimental nuclear physicist, former head of the IEA physics section, and founder of an award-winning high-tech startup company. Phil Larochelle, which is sitting next to Jennifer, is a partner at Breakthrough Energy Ventures with investment in 4 fusion companies and also working with the US Program of Energy. Before joining BEV, Phil was a senior technical program manager at Google X, working on several early-stage technology projects. And before that, he was an associate on the Google Energy and Renewable Energy investment teams. Last but not least, Nitendra. Nitendra is a nuclear engineering with expertise in nuclear safety and designing, working at ITER organization as a project associate responsible for the safety assessment of the tritium-breeding blanket system, and co-founder of Women in Fusion. So, let's move directly to the important part of the event, which is discussion with this group of experts. And the first question is, or the first part of the discussion, more than question, is fusion as an international endeavor, strengthening the global cooperation. How international licensing agreement can speed up fusion. How global markets can play a role. How core fusion countries can lead the development sharing with the rest. How to better coordinate and organize an industry, a fusion industry, and the deployment of fusion around the world. So I think we can start with Jennifer, please.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sehila. This has been a really important week for fusion energy here at COP28 with Secretary Kerry making a big announcement this past week related to international partnerships and a focus on growing international cooperation for fusion energy. This is not something new. There's been a highly collaborative fusion ecosystem with regards to the science and the R&D and other government collaborative projects. We have a colleague on the panel here who's part of one of those at ITER. But what we're seeing now is a real shift in thinking about the ecosystem in how we develop a new industry. How do we create a fusion industry? How do we bring commercial fusion plants to market as fast as possible? And how do we bring together all parts of that ecosystem, so public-private partnerships being a very important part of that, and leverage not just in an individual country those public-private partnerships, and those examples include members of the Fusion Industry Association. Many of those companies partner with the national labs to do R&D in the United States, or they have strong alliances and partnerships with universities where they're doing R&D. But that's now gone even further to start to think about what does an international cooperation look like. There's a number of bilateral relationships that already exist. So the one I know very well is the US-UK recently announced a bilateral relationship, thinking about how do we divide and conquer some of the technology challenges we have and not duplicate building the same test stands in the US and the UK. Why don't we cooperate? You build this one, we'll build that one, and share data and information. And that allows us to go much faster to get to solutions. So this new international partnership, it has a lot packed into it, and that has to do with workforce, regulations, other things. But it is also very much about this idea of how do we, as countries around the world, public and private institutions, advance fusion energy in a way that we leverage the strength of the public sector, the strong R&D capabilities that many of the national labs around the world and universities have, and combine that with the knowledge and the ability to build commercial fusion power plants in the private sector, and how can we put those partnerships together and make that work to go forward much further. I think we'll touch on regulations and other things in some other questions, so yes. I'll leave it at that as a high level. An exciting time. I think we're going to see a lot more cooperation coming forward, building on what's already been a pretty cooperative ecosystem today.
Yeah, excellent.
May I add to it? Thanks, Jennifer, for adding the public party, the part of the equation, as well as the cooperation thing. I'll start with one of the recent things which I have been told. In one of the plenary session, ITER has been called as one of the biggest example of cooperation globally. And that too, a fusion cooperation, that too in the scenario we are living with. So cooperation in that sense is very much required, and it is setting a good example. In addition to that, in the recent shift, the organization that ITER wants to lead the other fusion industry and the private sector to help with the research knowledge we are gaining with the project, and also to align all of them for the global cooperation for having the fusion industry uplifting globally. And just to give an example, 35 nations working together it's a feat in itself. So yeah, this is I wanted to add to it. Thank you.
Thank you. We move now to a second point, which
Can I briefly add something
Please,
to this?
please.
Okay, so Jennifer said something about the near future, things like the US-UK collaboration. Nitendra pointed out that for the last 20 years in ITER, there's already been a lot of international collaboration, actually also before that already. And I'd like to point at the longer term. If you look at where in the future, hopefully a lot of those fusion power plants will be built, it's going to be in countries that are not yet represented in ITER. It's going to be in the developing world where a lot of the future power will be built, and it would be a good thing if that would be fusion power and not, for example, coal or other fossil fuels. And we can see this coming. We can see that this is a development that is about to happen. And we, in my view, should start planning right now to include the developing world in this development, have them have a voice and an input, and be involved in the governance of it all as well.
Thank you. And that is related to one of the points that we want to include in that discussion is the creation of a workforce, but we'll come later. So the second point that I would like to touch is how fusion can actively contribute to meet the net zero objective. That is why we are here, and this is an important point to explain to society how can fusion contribute, because all these efforts are for something, and this is the main goal. So Ralf, could you comment on that?
Okay, so we kind of can see that it will take another 10 years plus minus until we'll have the first electricity produced by a fusion power plant that goes somewhere into the grid. Maybe it'll take 15, doesn't really matter. But it is something that we can see coming, okay? Once we're there, we have to build a lot of power plants. That's an entirely different thing than getting the first one to work. The first one to work is a scientific and technological problem to begin with. And afterwards, to build a lot has to do with rules, regulations, legislation, politics, international collaboration, etc. So if we can set up a framework that helps us do that, we'll be able to do it faster. If you look at the numbers that are involved, then you can see that there are at the moment about 60,000 power plants in the world. That's the order of magnitude. So if you then really want to make a dent in CO2 emissions by building fusion power, which has no CO2 emissions, you need to build of the order of 10,000 power plants. That's one plant per day for 30 years. That's the order of magnitude. Now, the good news is that if you look at the rollout of other comparable technologies, like the deployment of nuclear power in France, or the deployment of nuclear power in the US, they happened at about this time frame, about 30 years. So it is something that is doable if we look at the past and see what we've done before. So if we globally can do this and want to do this, we actually, in my view, are going to be able to build fusion power at a level that really has a significant impact on reducing CO2 emissions on the time scale of 2050, 2060.
And I'll just add one point to that people say that feels super ambitious to a lot of people. But what people aren't aware of is there's over 40 fusion companies in the world today, and that continues to grow. There's over $6 billion of capital invested into the private sector to develop these power plants that can be deployed and rolled out globally around the world. And so I think people should not underestimate the ability of good ecosystem cooperation for these private sector companies to be able to move. And we hope that several of them are very successful in the near term and we're able to get across that line. And the time frames that you referenced, the time frame for our company to put fusion power on the grid, we're aiming for the early 2030s to have our first plant putting electrons into the grid. So these timeframes are real and they're exciting, but there's a lot of effort happening broadly among all the private fusion companies, and that is a sector that just continues to grow with. We hear about a new fusion company probably every month.
Thank you. So linking to that, we need to finance fusion. So the question is how to finance fusion not only at domestic level, but also at international one. So how public-private partnership mechanism has help to speed up the development of fusion. The US is a good example, and how these schemes can be applied out of US and eventually internationally. So Jennifer, I think you can say a few words about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to address this because it's been a core sort of philosophy of how we as a company, Commonwealth Fusion Systems, operate in the world. And these public-private partnerships are really important to the idea of going fast. And why do we need to go fast? Because climate tells us we have to go fast. If we're going to hit the deployment curves that Ralf was just explaining we need to have, we have to be able to bring things to the grid here within the next decade. And so what we've done at Commonwealth Fusion Systems is we've set up a group that has gone out and said we can't hire everybody in the company to solve every problem we have. There are lots of smart and talented people that sit at universities. There are lots of smart and talented people that sit at the national labs in the United States. So we have dozens of cooperation agreements. We sometimes just do a basic research agreement trying to solve for one very bespoke issue, and we have an R&D agreement where we get to a result, and we have that result and it's published. And then we have broader strategic framework agreements, like the one we announced last year with the UK government, and we've built some of those with other governments around the world now, where we're working with their national labs in order to leverage the talent that's there to help solve some of the R&D issues that can help us move faster. So the premise of like public-private partnership is super important, and the U.S. government has recently recognized that. They put together a bold decadal vision for fusion in March of last year, and to put meat behind that, they've also launched what's called a milestone cost share program for fusion energy to bring private commercial fusion plants to the grid within the next decade. And that's an intensive program that we're working with the DOE to define how they can play a role in supporting some of that private fusion companies on their pathways through a cost share program, very similar to what NASA did with SpaceX. So there's a lot of exciting things happening from a public-private perspective that are important in helping us to really do what we're saying, go fast.
Any more comments about that?
I may add some. For the public-private partnership thing, one thing I'm regularly being listening about, especially for ITER, and I think I'll take this chance to clarify, that they always say that, private companies are going faster, what ITER is doing, it's slow and things like that. But this is one of the basis of all these private companies are coming after the ITER research, or what knowledge we are gaining from this. And to continue this and to have the experience in operation, in maintenance, and also to create the workforce training, ITER is already trying to lead the way in that sense. And we have started an initiative called Infused, the International Fusion Education Portal at ITER, which will have, in the growing time, it will grow further. But the idea is to have the shared knowledge at one place, and which will help all others to follow what is going on in the industry for the workforce training mainly.
Great, thank you. Any more comments? If not, we can move to the next point, which is going to be funding for fusion. So fusion industry requires investment of billions of dollars. How to catalyze that level of funding toward fusion? How to facilitate private investors to be part of this new industry? And can private investor funding make a difference in terms of providing the necessary support to speed up the development of fusion commercial system? Philip, I think you can say a few things about that.
Great. So yes, fusion requires billions and billions of dollars. It requires tackling very difficult engineering challenges that make going to space look kind of like, maybe a cakewalk or a moonwalk or whatever you want to call it. And I think what fundamentally has to happen to get all of these resources is to tell the story of fusion better and better and more successfully. And so I think that starts by saying, if it works, will it matter? And there I think there's an incredibly strong story, right? Fusion is the ultimate energy source. Every joule of energy that any of us has ever used has basically been fusion through intermediaries. Most people don't actually know that. They realize the sun is up there, but they don't always think about the fact that the sun gave us photons and heat, which led to wind, which led to the tides, and, well, not the tides, actually, everything but the tides. But then all of that stuff then went into growing plants, which then gave us fossil fuels, and even fission, which comes from heavy elements. Well, those heavy elements were made in the stars. So explaining to people the promise of fusion, I think we all have the curse of knowledge, the people who spend a lot of time thinking about fusion, but I think the general public can continue to understand why economical fusion power, it has to be economical, would be a big deal in terms of energy abundance, in terms of energy density, in terms of being able to tackle the traditional problems of safety, waste, proliferation, and cost that, of course, people across the nuclear industry are trying to tackle. So I think continuing to tell the story as to why fusion would be a big deal is something we have to keep getting better at. In terms of what it can do for climate change, how it can enable sustainable abundance for all. But then I think what we also have to do is talk about why fusion is no longer a pipe dream. I mean, that phrase, fusion is 30 years away and always will be, it's too bad that's such a good line, but we just have to banish that from popular discourse. Because in fact, fusion has made tremendous progress. I mean, from the 60s to the 90s, the tokamaks basically made faster progress on triple product than Moore's Law. Not a lot of people know that. So we at Breakthrough Energy Ventures are investors in 4 different fusion concepts: a tokamak and a stellarator in magnetic confinement, with Commonwealth Fusion Systems working on a tokamak, a company called Type 1 Energy working on a stellarator. We've also invested in inertial fusion through lasers, through a company called Exmer Energy. And then we've got kind of this less well-known concept called a Z-pinch, which is basically a fancy lightning bolt, through a company called Zap Energy. But I think the important point to emphasize is that there is good peer-reviewed research showing that there's been tremendous progress on the science and engineering front, which does make it realistic that on relevant timescales for conversations here, starting probably in the 2030s, you could have an amazing new baseload carbon-free source of energy. So I think first and foremost, to get more funding, both private and public, we have to keep iterating with organizations like the Clean Air Task Force and many others to tell the story of fusion, tell the story of progress, and then most importantly, why it would be commercially relevant. But then I would also say what's really amazing, and partially what we've learned by working with Commonwealth Fusion Systems and some of our other companies, is that when you take the time to explain the promise of fusion and what are all the things that would have to happen that can make it commercializable, once people actually think it might work, it's kind of amazing the support you can get. Now, we've seen that through projects like ITER, where an amazing collaboration of over half the world's population's governments have put in, let's just say, more money than they thought they would. But I think that speaks to the fact that they really think it's going to work. But then in the private industry, we've seen $6 billion go into private funding for commercial companies, and $2 billion just to CFS. But let me just say a bit more about where I think we have to go from here. Because we've seen great progress on the public side and on the private side, but we still have a long way to go. And so I think on that front, I think it's very important not only to say, here's the promise and here's the end goal, and say, here's why it could be cheap, but I think we also have to help the world understand what are the steps that we have to get to the end goal and all the progress that's being made. And so here, I'll take from kind of a framework that CFS has put out there, but we are in violent agreement with, which is we need to start telling the story that there are certain milestones you need to get in order to get to commercial fusion, and then help the different sources of government and private funding understand where we are on that path so they can see the progress is being made. And so those 6 steps, which I have now memorized, are first, can you control the plasma, which is basically the fuel? Can you actually control that and show that you understand how it works? Then the next is, can you get to the temperatures that are relevant? So that's, depending on your units, either a kiloelectron volt or 10 million degrees. Then it's this other figure called the triple product. And then after that, you start to go from science to actual commercial and power plant machines, which is, are you getting to energy break even? Then are you producing electricity? And then are you producing cheap electricity, right? And so I think the good news that we have to tell the people is we are now on step 4. For the first time in human history, the Lawrence Livermore National Lab in the United States showed scientific break-even, but ITER and other magnetic confinement concepts are probably hot on the tails. And then there's some other concepts that are promising as well. And then lastly, what I'll say in terms of how we can get this funding that's needed for fusion is to really have this synergy between public and private financing. And here I would point to what we think is a great model, which is the cost share program in the United States, which was actually modeled after what NASA did with SpaceX. And we could talk a lot more about the details of that. But what is great about that program is that it's risk sharing between the government and the private sector to make sure that the science is sound, that progress is being made, which is being kind of like neutrally arbitrated by people within the government who, should be neutral. But then it's risk-taking by private capital to make sure that, what the government is funding is actually producing results, and that it's ultimately the private companies, in large part, that have to take some of the risk. So, lots more to say on the funding front, but I think that there's been great news, the regulatory progress that's made in the United States, in the United Kingdom, the announcements that have happened here at COP. I'm optimistic, but let me just leave you with this point, and I think it's a good topic of debate. I think more and more, if fusion doesn't happen, it would probably be because it's underfunded. And so I think that that's a message to send. The biggest risk to fusion not happening is probably that we don't support it enough.
Please.
Can I add a little bit of an alternative view, because we've heard a lot about the importance of private funding. I work for General Atomics. We've been working on fusion for over 60 years. I've spent almost 20 years of my career there. And we have a little bit of a different view around the risk in fusion development. And within the United States right now, there isn't a publicly funded program to get a fusion pilot plant to the grid. They have a milestone program where they funded 8 or 9 different companies and have basically peanut buttered out a very small amount of funding amongst these companies. But unlike the UK, unlike some of China, there is no program that's publicly funded. And I'd just like to stress the importance of keeping government funding in this industry, because we really do have this valley of death where technology needs to be proven. Hard technology needs to be proven before we actually achieve a fusion pilot plant.
Okay, so there's a nice paper that was written in 1976 for the Department of Energy that looked in 1976, so quite a long time ago, at how much money and which funding profile would be necessary to get fusion electricity to the grid. The paper was republished in 1998. The author is called Stephen Odeen. You can look it up. And if you take the amount of money that they projected at that time and looked at different scenarios and translated into dollars today, it's of the order of $120 billion. So that's 100 to 120 billion. That's kind of like the price tag that they figured back then. Now, they looked at a different funding scenario and a couple of different ones, and the last funding scenario was labeled Fusion Energy Never. And if you look at the public funding for fusion energy in the United States, that stayed solidly under the line for fusion energy ever. So the public funding is correctly always been a little too less, not enough, and it was known that it was not enough, okay? That's the one thing. If I may say a second thing, so I think Phil's probably convinced you now that it's a really good idea to invest in fusion, right? So like you're gonna go home and you're gonna Google this and you're gonna go, where can I invest in fusion? And then you're gonna find out that you can't. Well, you can invest in companies that invest in fusion, such as Google or Microsoft, but you can't invest in one of the fusion companies because they're not publicly listed yet. And if you're, for example, I don't know if any of you are representing a pension fund or some other financial institution that does large-scale investing, then you're going to go, well, we don't enough understand which of those fusion companies is the one we should be betting on. Like, we're convinced fusion as a whole is bankable, but which individual fusion company, we don't know. So let me put this out there as an idea. What if there would be a global mega fund that invests in fusion, period, that invests in all of the fusion companies that have a likelihood to succeed, and that has a vehicle and a construction that allows you, not only as an institutional investor, but also as a private investor to invest. I believe there are a lot of people around the world that would want to do this, particularly after they've listened to Phil's story. Yeah, I was convinced before, but right now I really want to put money on the table for this. And if I could, I would. And I really think it would be important to try and create such a global mega fund that allows institutional investors and private investors to do just that.
I'll just add a closing, an interesting idea. I think we're looking to bring as much money and capital into the fusion sector as possible moving forward, so all ideas welcome around the table. I think the important part of thinking about the public funding, and I agree, it has been underfunded. We've seen some incremental change in some funding in the United States and other countries, but there's a lot more room to grow. But what has also changed is that was traditionally funding for much more of a science-focused program. And I think the important part is having the public sector and the private sector at the table together on how to spend that money the best way. And that's been a shift in thinking. And we're watching governments around the world realize that how do we bring together both of those with all the private capital funding in and with all the public money that's available in order to find the right path forward. And so I would encourage all the governments around the world, if you're thinking about fusion and you're thinking about what does this look like in my country, what are the policies, what are the regulations, what do we need to do, it's bringing the governments and learning from some of the governments that have been going fast, but and doing government-to-government engagement on those learnings. But then it's also bringing the private sector to the table, and sometimes those are private companies in your country, and if they're not in your country, there's a whole bunch of us out there that are willing to get on planes and talk about what we see the future to be, and what are the business conditions that have to exist within a country that make it an attractive market for a private fusion company, and how can we best spend public dollars thinking about building an industry.
Thank you. Well, linking to the public sector, the next point, which is exactly the role of the public sector. How to align needs of the fusion industry with the R&D done at the national institution, because the public sector has two big inputs. One is funding, and the other is knowledge. And they both are needed for the push of fusion. And also how the academia can support the setup of highly skilled workforce. Other problem in fusion, we are lacking workforce. And fusion programs need to be included in the curriculum at the universities and education centers. So, Nitendra, could you say a few words about that?
I'll be happy to do that. I'll begin with what we are trying to do at Women in Fusion first. So we realized this big knowledge gap. So along with ITER, when we already started the Infuse I talk about, at Women in Fusion, we are working out to have a curriculum where we can connect directly to this high school students globally. So this would be one of the idea, and we are already doing it for long now. So me being part of Indian Youth Nuclear Society, we are already having a boot camp, the energy boot camp. We are doing it every year with schools. So this is one of the area where we can encourage younger generation to join the workforce, which is one. Secondly, we are also trying to balance two aspects together. One, of course, the knowledge transition, as well as the gender gap. So Women in Fusion is also taking care of all this mentoring program. And along with this, we are also collaborating with other university and institutions to follow. Second. And third one, ITER has a program to collaborate with the universities in different countries. So all those universities can become a part of ITER cooperation, and they can exchange students for research and R&D and that sort of thing. So this is something which need to be done, and at ITER we are following it closely now to take a lead in that sense, to add more.
Thank you. Any other compliments on that? If not, maybe we can explore a little bit how these national labs where the knowledge exists, and as you mentioned, very precise projects are being carried out, and you have an expert on a precise thing that it could be very beneficial for the private sector to team up with them. How this transfer of knowledge or collaboration can be enhanced. There is a model in US which is working more or less. There are other places where that kind of transfer of knowledge is not so evident. You have IPR issues, you have to articulate a mechanism to make that thing possible. This is also a challenge for fusion. Maybe someone can comment on that.
Sure. So we do a lot of work within the defense sector and national labs within the United States, one thing that we found works very well are these licensing agreements. So part of our portfolio includes the Predator and Reaper aircraft series, which are unmanned aircraft. And one of the key technologies we have on ours was actually licensed from Sandia National Labs within the United States. And there's a program, a well-placed program that people know a lot about, and you can really tap into it and use that from a pragmatic perspective.
That is a very good tip. Not only from US, but from countries which are not US who are struggling with that kind of how make the private sector to benefit of a public paid knowledge. That
It's
is
a very good model.
Yeah.
Very good model.
Okay.
I would add to, from a fusion research perspective, each country has varying programs. I'm most familiar with the one in the U.S. and the program. So, for example, the DOE has stood up a number of programs where they help bring together grants for the national labs to do some of this research, and we will partner with the principal investigator at a national lab with one of our scientists at our company, and we'll jointly develop a grant program to kind of move forward with key R&D. And those grant programs, Infuse is one of them. It's not the same Infuse. It's got the same acronym, but it's called Infuse. Parts of the DOE, ARPA-E, have some programs for earlier stage companies, all the way up to, you think about the DOE loan program that exists and the ability for a company to go in and work at getting some of that low-cost capital for that sort of valley of death we were talking about to get across there. So I think governments can think in very creative ways of how to help foster those partnerships through programs that are very similar to those at the DOE. They've been very successful to date.
Thank you. That examples are really useful because if something has been tested and it works, maybe someone else can replicate it somewhere else. That is important. So we go to the last block of the discussion today, but I will say quite important. It's making fusion an inclusive workforce. We want to set up a new sector in fusion, and we have the chance to make it correctly from the beginning. So how to ensure this diversity in the workforce? First of all, how to attract workforce to fusion, because we need it, and how to make sure that this is in an inclusive way. We want to attract talent from young people. We want to attract people from other sectors and from other non-fusion countries too. So fusion needs all the talent, and how can we get all that talent and we can shape it in a correct way? So that is for Zabrina, and the rest later on can complement.
Yeah, this is a really important yet complex topic that I think a lot of people are probably grappling with. And so maybe I'll start with a story. When I started my career, I was an officer within the U.S. Navy and was the first woman on board the ship that I was on out of Pearl Harbor. When we deployed without having female restroom facilities on board. And I think that the people that were in charge just expected us to figure it out. Well, it added a lot of angst and strife among the crew trying to figure this really important issue out. And so I think that speaks to making it an inclusive environment. So no matter how many people we attract and we recruit to the industry, once they're there, holding on to them is just as important as the recruiting aspect of it. I think now, fast forward into the fusion industry, we do have a challenge because as we look at the existing workforce, there are very few women in terms of gender that are representative, and that may be because of the highly technical concepts. However, when you go back to school-age children, boys and girls score on par within these complex, highly technical fields. And so you start wondering, why is that? And this is something now that I've been devoting significant years of my life trying to understand. And I think a lot of it has to do with getting over that hump. So getting to the point where you're, whatever that percentage might be, say it's 30%, where you have female representation, it's always going to be a challenge until you get there. And so making sure that you're helping bootstrap that and bring those women into the workforce is extremely important. And then the last thing I'll add is we tend to think of fusion right now in terms of plasma physicists and these types of physicists, right? I was in a shipyard building a ship, and I understand that it's not just the people that are designing, it's the people that are constructing and the tradespeople and everyone else that goes within this ecosystem of building a fusion workforce. And so we really have to be more creative about where we're recruiting from. And there's an organization within the United States called Society of Women Engineers, and it's a global organization. And so tapping into organizations like that might be a very good partnership to help bring forward a fusion workforce.
Now, this is very important because we need to look at other sectors. We are offering a really challenging opportunity to any person to join to fusion, so we need to go around and get that talent too, because it's needed for fusion, by the way. So not only young people, which are very important, but the rest of the sectors where fusion can offer a really promising, challenging opportunity for someone who is interested in doing something good for mankind, honestly. So any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I'd like to add the dimension of developing countries here once more, if I may. So I don't know if you're familiar with Hans Rossing's concept of the global pin. So he looks at, where do people live in the world? And in the future, when we have 10 billion people on the planet, the global pin is going to be 1135, he says. So that's 1 billion people in North and South America, 1 billion people in Europe, including Eastern Europe, 3 billion people in Africa, 5 billion people in Asia. Now, I work for an institute where we try and train scientists from developing countries in how to do cutting-edge science. And we believe that talent to do science is uniformly distributed around the globe. So if you look at that population density distribution in the future, and the fact that you find talented people with equal likelihood everywhere around the globe, and then you look at the fact that what's not equally distributed is the opportunity for those talented people to actually develop their talents. And that directly relates to the workforce for fusion. I believe that to have the right number of people for this enormous task to build large numbers of fusion power plants in a short time, we should start now to develop the workforce in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Important remark, because we need to be able to find a mechanism to articulate that transfer of knowledge to them. Any comments or questions?
Something that I'll just say, which I think is an advantage for being able to build up an awesome workforce and get great people to work in this industry, is just how exciting and energizing the idea of fusion is. And now Jennifer probably won't say this because she's too humble, but Commonwealth Fusion Systems has won the best startup in the United States to work for, according to Forbes, for 2 years in a row. And part of that is culture, part of that is the great job that they've done with diversity, but part of it is also that if you tell the story right, people would love to work for fusion, just like they would love to work on space. So I think if we do it right, you can get an amazing workforce, you can get talent from all the best places. And so I think that there's a really strong story for not only pursuing great science, but building great institutions and companies and research labs. So we should use that as a superpower.
Yeah, I think Zabrina and Ralf highlighted, we just need to get the word out. We do find that when we start to talk to people about what the opportunities are and the diversity of opportunities, it's not just plasma physicists. It's we have technicians who don't have college degrees all the way up to PhDs, and people writing the most advanced software, working on advanced codes. There's really interesting work to be done, but if they don't know about fusion, it's harder to get them there. But once they learn about it, they get pretty excited about the mission and the impact that fusion could have on the world, and to be part of building that.
I think the whole key word here is tell the history. Yeah. People don't know. And since they don't know, this is not it's not in the radar. And it's a challenge for the fusion people that we all have to tell the history out of fusion, not to talk to our community all the time.
Yeah, we need to tell that we are in the journey from reals to reality. We have seen fusion so far in Spider-Man and Back to the Future kind of thing. We need to tell people, especially young people, that we are in the journey now. So what you have seen already, now you can be the part of it, and that's most exciting, at least for me. So it will help.
We need to spread the news. We need to show people what fusion is, how fusion is moving, and how they can contribute to something which is beyond a company. It's the whole new revolution. So that is really appealing.
Sun in the bottle.
So We have finished with our key points for today, but we have some time for the public to put any question to our panelists. So take advantage. You don't have this bunch of people every day sitting together. So please, this gentleman, and then first and second. Oh, yeah.
Thanks. This is for Zabrina. You mentioned something about the public-private partnership. And as you know, 2 days ago, Department of Energy announced the IFE STAR program, and GA is part of 2 of those. So my question is, what are you expecting to get out of that public-private partnership?
So on both of those, we are a subcontractor, and just for the target for NIF, which has achieved ignition now several times, we build the target. So we build the thing that it shoots. And as we're now looking toward inertial fusion energy, not just inertial fusion technology, we need to make those targets so that they can shoot multiple of them per second. So reduce cost and increase frequency and efficiency. And so we're looking more toward that aspect of it, of how to increase the repetition of making a target and increase the efficiency.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Rodrigo Fernandes from Bentley Systems. Don't know if the name rings a bell to someone here, but let me just say I'm Director of Sustainability, environmental engineer. So Bentley Systems works in providing software for designing, constructing, building infrastructure. So I would say that ITER, the fact that I'm from Bentley Systems, that Bentley Systems is involved in ITER, it's probably one of the projects that I'm most proud of. So I was already teleported to the tokamak and to the nuclear to the fusion reactor, because the synchro software was used for the 4D planning and scheduling of it, and then we developed Metaverse with Greg Demchak. I don't know if the name rings a bell. Okay, so it's amazing. Although I have mixed feelings here, because I would like to be at least here in this planet when we start seeing this creating energy, and I would like that we have still, avoiding global warming and the milestones for net zero SBTI by 2050. So what I find is that it won't be possible, right? This will not help us at achieving the milestones for net zero by 2050. It's almost nearly impossible. So my question, I hope we can find alternative solutions to stay, all good till there. And how do you see the future of energy by starting by 2050, when we will start have fusion coming into our grids? How do you see the balance, the energy balance? How do you predict? Do you feel? Because I also expect that other sources of energy the LCOE will decrease, right? So. So just would like to hear your predictions or your forecasts on that.
I'm happy to take that first, because the first thing I'll do is I'd love to challenge you on that premise that you just put out there of we won't even see plants till the 2050s. The Fusion Industry Association does a survey every year of when the companies expect to start to see their technology on the grid. The majority see this happening in the 2030s. And our timeline that we've talked about and we've published and we're moving forward with and showing milestones that we're progressing is to have that first plant on the grid in the early 2030s. And when you ask that question, how can we see that have an impact on net zero in 2050? We're thinking about this so differently than we thought about how to scale an industry before. So at Commonwealth Fusion, we're designing a fusion machine, and it will be a 400 megawatt net electricity machine. And there'll be a balance of plant that sits around it to make energy or run an electrolyzer or do lots of interesting things, possibly, to get us to a cleaner future. But we're thinking about it at how we can build at scale. So we hire people from Boeing, GM, Tesla, people who think about manufacturing at scale. And we're doing that from day one on how can we build a fusion machine, show the world that it works, and then be able to put one of those in the world every day. you have to have gigafactories that are putting out the components, and the components are being shipped around the world, and they're being assembled and turned on a regular basis. And we're just one fusion company, and there's many. We're not saying fusion is going to be everything and replace everything. No. But fusion's going to play a very big role in that gap of, if you talk to utilities today, there's that last 20% nobody knows how to solve, right? To get to net zero. It's really hard. And so the Fusion Industry Association and the companies that belong to that, we're thinking a lot differently about how do we not only develop the technology, but then have the ability to scale very quickly. And the example I gave is how we think about it, because we know it won't matter and it won't have the impact unless we can think about it that way. So I would challenge you, I would really hope that we are in a world in 2050 where we see a lot of fusion machines all around the world in every continent.
I may add to it just a bit. So what you have raised and what Jennifer has said, it is the thing which is coming up. We at ITER are already in that phase. So the challenges which we are facing with the first-of-a-kind components is some of very unique. We have not thought of it, which is really coming. So this experience is helping a lot to all those industries that even if you scale it up, what sort of challenge you can face. So we are in a way contributing to the future aspect which will be coming while scaling up on an industrial scale. So that's one of the role ITER is trying to play for all those upcoming fusion industry for the scaling of the plant systems. So to add.
I'll just say quickly to your question, how fast fusion gets deployed is not independent of the amount of will and resources and effort that is put into it. And so, it's true that maybe there wouldn't be a precedent for something scaling as quickly as you need for 2050, but, things don't have a precedent until those efforts get put into shape. I mean, if you look at the ramp of production that happened when there was a war or things like that, I love a book called Freedom's Forge. No one ever thought you could turn out that many Liberty ships, right? Which is an amazing accomplishment. So it's just to say, I think that how much it gets deployed and when it gets deployed is a function of how much the public and private sector supports it. And I think we always have to keep that in mind. But then the other thing I'll say is that, climate change and net zero doesn't stop at 2050. Not only do you have to decarbonize, you also have to bring up the standard of living of everyone in the world. And I think that if you're looking for everyone to be able to live, at a high standard of living while also being sustainable for the planet, that might be the really interesting part of fusion, is not only can it let you get to net zero and allow you to avoid dangerous climate change, but it can also allow everyone to be wealthy while doing so. I mean, fusion is such a game changer on so many levels that it really could be like a key piece of this idea of sustainable abundance for all. And I think that's the really exciting part, is it's not only avoiding dangerous climate change, which, is avoiding disaster, but it's really telling a positive, optimistic story about the future of humanity. And that goes well beyond 2050. I mean, I think, we're going to have the first commercial fusion reactor sometime in the next century. I hope it's going to be in the next decade or two. But then after that, we're going to be building better fusion reactors for the next 10 million years. This is not just about 2050. It's about well beyond that, and it's about more than climate change.
I'll go one step further than Phil and give you a nice quote. Fusion is inevitable. As Phil pointed out, all the energy that we're using, except the tides, everything that we're using actually originates from fusion power. If you want to know if it works, you just need to go outside and look up, and there's a fusion reactor in the sky. So it does work. And it is inevitable that as a civilization, eventually we will power everything with fusion power. The only question is, are we going to go and make an effort right now, or we're going to do something else and first mess up the planet and then have to clean it up again afterwards and then do fusion power?
Okay, thank you. Carlos.
Thank you. Great insights. Thanks for sharing your time with us here. I want to pick up a little bit, Jennifer, when you mentioned about and maybe it's too early to think about supply chain going forward, but nevertheless, I'm trying to draw parallels to where we see on the fission side, these advanced reactors, small modular reactors, and there's over 70 under development right now. And as we look at from the fusion side, all these startups and companies developing those, is there a possibility to converge into standardization at some point? I mean, from a supply chain, and how do you scale up, in deployment? I don't know if you guys can speak to that a little bit.
I can speak to our way of thinking about it and the industry as well. We think about a supply chain a lot. We're buying a lot of things right now because we're building our Spark, which is our demonstration machine that's going to be in Devens, Massachusetts, and turn on here in the next few years. But we're always thinking, what does this vendor mean to us as we scale and we need to build a whole bunch of power plants, right? And so the Fusion Industry Association did a report. It's a really good one you should go see if you want to look at it. They did a global supply chain report last year for the first one. And it's going to be a regular cadence in which they do that. And the industry recognized we are going to have to scale a lot of things, but a lot of the components that we need within fusion machines are things that are readily available today. There's not a lot of special things that have to happen, but we'll need a lot of more semiconductors. We'll need more basic materials. So we're thinking about that, and by all means, I think each of these companies is trying to say, how do I build a machine that enables me to have a supply chain that's robust and that can grow and meet those needs. And as a whole, in the industry, there's a positive outlook of this can all scale. This is not something that is insurmountable. It is just we have to be thinking about it today and having those conversations early. So when we approach suppliers, we don't say, can I have this one component for this one machine I'm building in Massachusetts? We say, we're going to build an industry. We'd like to talk about a component for this machine, but this machine is the design that will be our power plant, and therefore there'll be a lot more. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg we find with some companies. They have to make a capital investment in order to scale up supply, and we haven't demonstrated it yet. And so some people are taking the ride with us, and they're excited, and they see the tremendous opportunity that Fusion offers to be part of that supply chain. Other companies are in a wait-and-see mode a little bit. So, but we think there doesn't appear to be the barrier to scale. And I think the work that's being done for ITER, the magnets that General Atomics is building today, they're already standing up a supply chain for a lot of that work that we can all sort of take advantage of.
So I want to interject for a minute from a pragmatic perspective, because I've thought about this a lot. And you brought up fission and the fact that there are 70 different reactor designs. And given my background in the nuclear Navy, I always go back to how did we get commercial nuclear power, right? It started from the military. It started from Admiral Hyman Rickover. And when he moved forward with thinking about nuclear power, he didn't have 70 designs. He had 2. And he had the backing of the U.S. government, the regulator, everything on his side, Congress, to be able to move it forward and reduce risk. And we're not doing that right now in the fission sector within the United States. And we've seen recent setbacks, I think, because there isn't a big public engagement. Now looking at fusion, unfortunately, the United States is funding fusion the same way. And we've peanut buttered out this money among 8 or 9 different reactor designs. I think we really need to be more focused on where we put our money. And we don't look at multiple different types of designs, but we actually put everything toward one and move it forward. And that includes reducing risk in supply chain using public funding.
Which one should it be?
I think there should be a study to decide, right? No, but seriously, the Defense Department within the United States, that's how they fund technologies. They fund 1 or 2, and then they down select, and I think that's a pretty good model looking forward on how to get something built.
Okay, if I may say something about standardization as well. If you travel around the world and you need to, plug in your phone to charge it somewhere, you all know that you're going to have the wrong plug along. And that's super annoying. That makes no sense. We're completely failed as a civilization to be able to have power plugs around the world that make sense, right? Now, if you look at the interfaces, the connections, that's in my view the first thing that you need to standardize. So, for example, the first generation, at least, of fusion power plants, they're disappointingly all still going to boil water, right? Now, eventually we will get away from that, but the first generation will still boil water, which means they will still drive a turbine, and from then on, it'll look like nowadays any power plant looks like. That's a turbine, and then it keeps going. So maybe start with standardization, the connection between the fusion power plant and the part that deals with the steam and the turbines, and standardize that so that when you're doing this, you don't have to have, oh, we now have fusion, now we also need to build a different turbine because it doesn't fit with what we've done. That needs to fit. Also gives you the chance to go and say, hey, we have this old coal power plant. We can still keep this turbine part here that works. We're just going to replace the bit that boils the water, and we're going to do that with fusion now. That'll make it cheaper, faster, easier to adapt, and you already have the network.
I'll just add one comment because I think about this a little bit differently being at a startup, right? When search became something that was going to be maybe revolutionary and changing, we didn't make a bet on one search engine. There were lots of search engines. And the market told us which search engine won. And then a lot of money and a lot of capital and a lot of growth happened behind the leading search engines that we see today. Is fusion like search? No. But the idea of multiple shots on goal at what's a really hard technology. I mean, this is hard. This is not easy. And so I think there's a place in the market today to say, what are the multiple shots on goal? We don't know which one's going to win. I think the government doesn't want to pick a winner is the issue. That's I think where it came down to. They said,
government.
we don't want to pick a winner. We want to let a couple support different technologies and figure out which one's going to get across the line faster, which one is going to be the one that can scale, and then probably shift their funding and everything as we start to see the winners come out in the marketplace. But from that perspective, I would say having lots of ideas and lots of technology approaches is a good thing for humanity because, shoot, I think we're going to get a couple of them across the line.
First, a little comment. We see $6 billion of investment in private, and people say, whoa, that's a lot of money. $30 billion for ITER, whoa, this is a lot of money. But this is $1 billion a year. They put $1 trillion a year of subsidies for the oil and sand, $1 trillion. Hundreds of billions a year in wind, solar, and other thing. So this ITER thing is just peanuts. Those private guys, like small change, like the little 10 cents at the bottom of your wallet. So to make fusion happen, you'll need more money than that. Like, what you said there, 100 billion? Okay, so now we're starting to talk real cash. But so don't be scared of those big numbers. They're actually quite small. So that's my comment. And then my question is, say, we need to talk more about fusion. Me, what I don't like is the we. We, the queen, we. We need to do this. So who's going to actually do that? Who will make fusion being a little bit more on the news? I used to say that fusion is doing good progress right now. Because when I started 20 years ago, my little general fusion company, the news about fusion was maybe 1 part in 1,000,000. And now we're probably at 1 part in 1,000. Hey, we're 1,000 times more. Great progress. But we're still 1 part in 1,000. You read a lot about windmill and solar, geothermal, chicken shit, whatever. But you will rarely hear about fusion still. It's better, but I would say it's still about 1 part in 1,000. And you're right. Before fusion getting a thing we have to talk about with more, I think we need to achieve at least, 1 part in 20. But we're still, so who we do that?
The Clean Air Task Force.
Well, I have to say I'm very proud that program of Clean Air Task Force on fusion, and part of the program is regulation, harmonization, standards, and to tell the history. But when I say we, I mean all the players in fusion, Clean Air Task Force for sure, ITER, Commonwealth Fusion System, Energy Ventures, ICTP, Ralf is always offering opportunities, General Atomic, and I have to say the community in general is now getting out and speaking about and getting space on the newspapers, on the magazines, on the TV, on movies. We need to put more effort, that's true. But when I say we, it's all players in fusion. No one can escape.
Well, I'll add one thing to that. I think that traditionally we've allowed the physicists to talk about fusion and to communicate about fusion. And there's a little bit of a language barrier challenge there. And so we could probably do ourselves some favors by getting some other people out there, some folks that connect with, other people within the communities we're trying to reach to tell our story a little better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe one quick comment before.
Yes.
I was there in World Nuclear Exhibition last week, and I saw one change which was different from others. So before, if you go to World Nuclear Exhibition, there was no mentioning of even ITER or fusion, forget about it. But this time, starting from the opening plenary session until any of the panel we had, there was a mentioning of fusion, the role it can play in climate change and all other net zero activities, especially mention of ITER, because setting an example for all training and all sort of R&D for that program. And what was more surprising for me was, so we were having one ITER booth in WNE, but there were so many other booths from different industry, from different country who contributed to ITER, and this biggest mark was that ITER, that we are supplying to this. So in a way, I felt like it was a big umbrella of fusion already in that community as well. So yeah, maybe we are slow, 1 in 1,000, but still
Moving.
approaching in that direction.
Coverage of COP28, see how much you see fusion.
The
Ratio of the number of papers to the one that says fusion.
but look,
A lot more than it used to be.
more than used to be. That's the point.
You're completely correct. If you look into the policy summary of the IPCC report, like the bit that actually gets read by the advisors to politicians, 40-page summary, the word fusion is not in there. Okay, there are lots of other words in there much more frequently. The word fusion is not in there. I think it should be one goal that in the next IPCC summary report, the word fusion is in that
That is
summary
our
so people see it.
That is a very good point. Yes. We need to finish now, but we have some refreshment now, some food. We have around 20 minutes to enjoy that, so I will ask you to stay around, make good use of the wine and the drinks, and our expert will be also around, so you can ask them and complain why they are not more proactive in putting fusion everywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you.